what this side of the house is going to give you. First of all, we're going to establish the Olympics as a significant security risk in London. Secondly, we're going to tell you, what we're going to do second, we're talking about the standard of our policy. What are we actually going to do here? What are we going to change? Third, I'm going to talk to you about the mechanism which we want to introduce, the risk-reward mechanism by which we think the debate ought to be judged. Sammy's going to go into more detail about that mechanism. And then finally, we're going to hear a summary of both sides of the debate. So, the Olympics is a security risk. Why do we think the Olympics are a significant security risk? So we think that the risk of attacking the Olympic Games is really self-evidently higher than it is at other times in the year in the UK and in London. Why is this? I think for several reasons. So firstly, it's the profile of the event. We think that more publicity means more publicity-driven attacks. I mean, lots of attacks are driven by publicity or a need to get publicity. So one example of this is terrorism. Things like terrorism attacks are by definition designed to create a perception of a lack of safety, which goes above and beyond the actual lack of safety that exists in the environment which we introduce it. I think that publicity exacerbates this because it means there's more eyes on the event, it means the event seems like a higher profile security breach, and I think that means it's more likely people do it. I'll take it in a minute. I mean, secondly, there's going to be more politically motivated attacks. Why? I think, in particular, the foreign policy of the UK means that there's a degree of animosity towards the UK amongst lots of people. I think that a high-profile event means that, we have these problems where a country like Switzerland perhaps doesn't. I think that also there's a perception of the UK as being a seat of power of Western dominance, an ally of the USA. A big event coming to the UK in this fashion means that we're going to be more likely to be targeted by events like this. So,
how many hulls do you think they should have put on the Titanic in order to stop it sinking when it hit an iceberg?
One, perhaps. So basically, believe it or not, that metaphor doesn't really kind of jive with the way we want to introduce the debate. I'll explain to you our actual mechanism by which we think this is going to work, and then you can tell us how it relates to the Titanic in your own speech. Now, standard policy. What are we actually going to do here? So what we're doing is because we're saying that for the duration of this event, we're going to judge policy and the way we apply security policy in the UK slightly differently to the way that we judge it outside of the Olympics. So what are we going to do? So what we're going to do is we're going to judge policies in terms of policing, in terms of security, in terms of access and mobility and things like that. Really, almost without reference to inclusion, just for the duration of this event. So what are some examples of this? So we're going to say every time we see that we can gain some security and give up some inclusion for the duration of the event, we're going to do that for the duration of the event. What are some examples? I think there's going to be less access to public space when things like marathons are cordoned off. I think that's going to have some impact on the communities. We're happy to do that. We'll tell you why. We think it's going to be some screening, so people who look a bit dodgy or something are going to be stopped by the police more. Can expand stop and search powers for reviews a bit more extensively for the duration of the Olympics. Taking a minute. And we think high security means that we're going to have high security measures on the tube, for example. That means decreased mobility for some communities. We understand that. And we think that we're not going to allow large protests for the duration of events, things like that. And also we're going to take international conflicts into account, as with all Olympics, things like the Israeli team will live in a high security compound. We're going to carry on doing the things the Olympics always does in that regard. Yeah.
And what do you think is going to be the long-term effects on the ethnic minorities, the local people of the communities? So for this specific amount of time, there's heightened security, but what do you think the legacy is on the people and the communities who are affected by this?
So we're happy to concede that there's a loss of inclusion here. We're perfectly happy to say that's what we're trading. What we're not happy to have is we think it's going to be a far greater loss of inclusion if we have a massive security breach of the Olympics. Furthermore, we think that all the inclusion that these guys are going to bring you is temporary and superficial for lots of reasons that we'll get on to. And what we don't want to do is not to tie this debate to too many specific concrete policies. What we're saying is that we're changing the test of a policy. So if within a reasonable limits, so we're not setting up a police state or anything, right? So at the price of inclusion, we can get security, and we're going to go for it within reasonable limits. So let me introduce to you this risk-reward mechanism. So we think that if we can show that the risk of not adopting our policy is higher than the rewards we get from the possibilities of inclusive policies that these are going to bring you, I think that means that we win the debate. So what are the rewards? I think we get a superficial inclusion. It's not how people usually interact with each other. They're all using the space for the same reason, which isn't good, and the problems of inclusion come with people trying to share spaces and accept each other using spaces for different reasons. I think it's also temporary, right? It's built in a situation that won't outlast the Olympics. Whereas London is a permanent thing, right? So London's going to be here long after the Olympics, and we don't want to risk the damage to the inclusive policies that we have, which we think work quite well for this. We think the security beeps can have lasting effects on inclusiveness, and Sally's going to tell you more about the risk-reward mechanism during her speech. So for all those reasons, Mr. Speaker, we're proud to be in proposition.